My colleagues are Dimitri and Chris, and Ed tasked us with the idea of trying to figure out a way to create a sustainable digital news archive. That's our goal. So what we had to do first was to identify some issues, what some of the problems are. Now, what we first looked at was the idea that content is fragile. And by that, we mean what is content? It's text, it's video, it's photos, but however they're recorded, they can be degraded. We realized that losing archives risks losing a bit of our culture. That picture right there is one of the best remaining pictures of the historic Apollo 11 moonwalk. Unfortunately, a lot of the high-quality images were lost. So we know that there's some economic and cultural benefit. We also looked at the problem that smaller newspapers don't have the capacity to create an archive, and there's no centralized repository. We also looked at the fact that there are previous attempts to create a digital archive. Last year, excuse me a little bit, I'm on a caffeine high right now. There have been previous attempts at creating an archive. Last year, the symposium heard a proposal from a team called ANDAC. And what previous attempts have been bogged down is a production process that has been unsustainable. Too high a cost has created a unrealistic pricing structure. So what our proposal is to partner with a media monitoring company. And what we have found is there's a gap, an opportunity to improve the efficiency of media monitoring companies and to actually help grow their business. So with that, more details on that idea, hand it off to Dimitri.
Thank you, Kevin. So we plan to run a pilot study in the state of Missouri, and in this state, News Group has nice relationships with almost every newspaper in the state, but only half of them submit digitally to the News Group, and half of them actually mails the print version of the newspaper. And this approach is time-consuming and labor-intensive and less efficient overall, because you need to mail the physical newspaper every week or every day, and then you need to run it through the scanner, so you need to have people, you need to have the scanner. And one of the needs that have been identified for the news group for the further improvement is the need to get more of the smaller newspaper publishers on board with digital submissions. And the second need that has been identified for news group is the need to be able to acquire the online-only content. And that means that right now, news group has access to what goes in the print newspaper or the PDF version of such, but they might not necessarily reaching to the online-only content that newspapers put on their websites. And more often than not, it's the same content, but sometimes it's different, and it would be nice if they would be able to reach it as well. So our solution, what we propose to do is to go to these newspaper publishers and set up some IT infrastructure for them, so they would be able to submit digitally to the news group. And also to talk to them and write a script so they would be able to reach this online-only content as well. And there is the value in this for the news group. As I mentioned before, it will make the process more efficient and less costly, so we will cut the costs with this approach. And they will have more data overall to sell because of this online-only content. And the way archive works is the more information you have in the archive, the more valuable it is. And we have this altruistic mission of preserving the news content. And we plan to operate a nonprofit, and out of the research and educational institutions such as Reynolds Journalism Institute. So we will have access to the funds that the news groups themselves might not necessarily have access to. So we plan to subsidize a lot of the costs of setting up the infrastructure, training the people, writing scripts with grant money. Also, there is value in this partnership for the JDNA project as well. As I mentioned before, we want to preserve content, and Newsgroup already has a lot of newspapers sitting on their services, more than 10 terabytes of data. So for our mission, it would be very valuable if we could save the content and create an archive, structured or otherwise. And we would benefit from Newsgroup having good relationships with press associations and newspaper publishers themselves. And we would benefit from the resources that Reynolds Journalism Institute has to offer. There is also value for the publishers themselves in this partnership. They will have free archival and backup services, and they will have additional opportunities to monetize on their content because of this online-only content that we will be reaching out to. The project is divided into 2 stages or phases. The first stage or phase for first 5 years approximately, that's where we will apply for grants and we'll formally set up the nonprofit somewhere here in the RGI. We will have the web server with the archive, and we will partner with the news group, and we will start setting up this infrastructure, scripts, and training people at the newspapers. And the second phase, once we build this archive and gather the data, the second phase will be try to develop the new market segments. Because right now, primarily customers of the news groups are lobbyists, politicians, media monitoring companies. But we've also found that there is value to other type of customers in other market segments, such as lawyers, law firms, and genealogists. And they see value in archival content, archival news content. So we plan to reach them, but that's for the future. And with this, I'd like to pass it over to Chris, who will talk more about how it will work.
Thank you. So I will be discussing a little bit here about the little bit more technical details on exactly what this partnership would entail. So initially, of course, we'll be mirroring the server. That creates a secondary backup. That gives us our archive. That makes it so that if any of the content of the server goes down, if a tornado blows through, everything remains saved. Secondarily, Newsgroup already has an algorithm that they currently use that captures data in PDF form as it goes to be published in most cases. Now, eventually, we would like to take that algorithm, work with it a little bit, possibly work with the computer science department here at the university. One of the huge advantages we have is access to engineering resources, especially things like comp sci capstones, etc., and modify that so we can capture not just PDFs but article level content before it all becomes amalgamated into a single PDF, decreasing costs in the long run. We'll be able to take that algorithm out to newspapers that are currently submitting in print, so they're mailing a newspaper in. We'll be hiring technical assistants who will be installing that software. We may end up using secondary methods for some of the less technically advanced newspapers, such as a simple drag and drop box where it'll be mirrored back to a secondary source and then transferred to a server. This sort of exactly how that would work will have to be determined once we've had some time to go out and survey, figure out exactly why they're not submitting. And then basically, Newsgroup will be working on monetizing this new content. So JDNA archives it, Newsgroup continues to monetize. So let's talk about financials a little bit. We're looking at about $150,000 to really get this project off the ground. What's included in that is a couple technical assistants, renting server space, and about 15-20% of overhead costs for algorithm development and some unexpected cost space. Naturally, being in a university, we do have advantage in resources. We already have a legal department, management team. Naturally, Ed would be managing that. He takes salary from the university. So that kind of helps keep our startup costs down. The other advantage being a nonprofit associated with the universities, we'd be able to apply for grants, considering that our goal here is not to monetize the content, but rather to save it. What we really want is an accessible archive. We're just simply utilizing the fact Newsgroup can sell this data to try and keep it evergreen so that we don't have to continue pulling in grants. So in theory, we should only need the first grant. Now, based on some cost estimates, we believe we can save Newsgroup for the state of Missouri $50,000 to $70,000 a year so in their initial processing costs. So if we can reduce the number of newspapers they're pushing through scanners, reduce man hours reading the newspapers, and let all of that be done server side by an algorithm, it should roughly reduce their acquisition cost of that space by half. Currently, half the newspapers in Missouri submit via digital and about half submit via mail. So we're looking at some relatively rough estimates in this particular space, but they should be right at least in order of magnitude. So far as the profit share would be concerned, we're looking at between $15,000 and $30,000 a year. That's based on a 20 to 30% profit share model, where any article that basically we bring in, so the newspaper used to submit via print, now they submit digitally, so any of those articles, there's a profit share that would naturally be discounted over 10 years, 5 years, some amount of time to recoup the costs. And after that, of course, the profits would simply go back to Newsgroup, and at that point, we would be sustaining ourselves off of the archive. That would be the phase 2 that we discussed, which we really don't have good estimates for. Order of magnitude, we believe that the data after it's aged about 10 years, data is kind of interesting that way. No one really, they want it right away, or they want it 10 years later. In that space in between, there's really not a lot of opportunities for monetization. So that's what this would do for us, is we'd be able to operate our servers off of this 15 to 30K over that time space, and then once the archive actually becomes valuable, we can remonetize it, arguably through Newsgroup. We'll have to work out exactly how that licensing would work. It's worth mentioning that right now we are merely in discussions on this. Naturally, we're glad that they're here, and we'll be working with them in the future in order to actually develop contracts. We do not have any formal agreements at this point, but rather an interest to work together, and of course this will be continuing into the future. How are we going to really sustain this and really get it going, not just in Missouri, but nationwide? So what Missouri will do is produce a trial case. I've thrown a lot of estimates up here, a lot of very round numbers. We do this for the first state, we do this for Missouri, and we'll tell us how good these estimates really are. How much money is this really going to be saving Newsgroup? Are we really going to be able to get the 90 to 95% of newspapers we want submitting digitally? So we'll be producing a trial case on grant money. Once we have a financial model established and we can show those cost savings, we can go to Kansas, we can go to Texas, we can go to any of the other 13 remaining states that Newsgroup has a presence in and do the same thing there. We'll know what those cost savings are likely to be and can use that money as a front. So say you're going to save $50,000 or $70,000, and so we think we can convert this state for $100. You'll make that money back over the next year and a half. We can do that as a cost front. We can do it as a loan. We can do it a couple of different interesting ways. That, once again, financial model have to be worked out completely, but that does create a sustainable, reproducible model for exactly how this archive will be built. Once it's built, once it's aged a little bit, once we've discounted those cash flows, at that point, we should be able to sustain ourselves in that phase 2 that we've mentioned. So overall, our goal is to save this born digital content. A lot of this content, small newspapers may keep on a hard drive somewhere. It's not indexed. It's not clearly labeled. It's not accessible by anyone else. If there's an anthropologist who wants to research a small town or look at what life is like in small town Missouri 30 years from now, they're not going to be able to find that data. So what this archive will do is house all of that data in one place where it's easily accessible and well archived, easily searchable. Everyone can get to it. And we've done this in a cost-sustainable way where we'll be able to take these articles and actually turn them into some amount of money to keep the servers running. So we're not going to end up with just another dark archive in the pile of newspapers. So with that, I'd like to take any questions that you may have.
Sure, you want me to get started?
You're live.
I really like your idea here. I'm familiar with this concept. I was involved in the ANDAC proposal last year, so I'm bought into the concept that there's value in digital archives. So I understand that, and I like the fact that you're proposing a scalable solution. You're right to focus small and then try to scale it from there. And digital submission is really important to this. So I think you're on the right track to focus on that. That's also a huge challenge. So one of my questions to you is, because so much of your project depends on this, this digital, content, and also because only half of the publishers today are submitting digital. I wonder how you think you're going to convince the other half to submit digital when they're not now. I mean, the model of submitting is not radically different. You're talking about, maybe for the smaller publishers, submitting PDFs like a lot of the publishers are submitting now. You're also talking about building infrastructure to grab digital native content. What's your value proposition to publishers to make them want to get on board with this?
So I think the city of Joplin's a very good example for this. Is whenever the tornado blew through a few years ago, a news group had a lot of the newspapers' previous publications on their server, and whenever the servers were lost in Joplin, they had no other backup. So we'll be providing for free the entire archive of their content. So they go, hey, we lost our servers, or we had file corruption. Can you recover this for us? And so that's the exchange that they get in turn for sending us their information. Also, they are already converting. I don't remember the exact rate at which they are converting. I'm sure that Brad probably remembers that figure, but they are converting from physical mailing to digital. We would just be speeding that up. So there is some evidence that they have a want to do this, and they're recognizing it's important. By cooperating with the Press Association and by actually sending someone to their paper and showing them how simple it really is, they have cost savings from mailing, because it's significantly cheaper to send electrons than it is to send paper, as well as, once again, the digital backup of their content should some kind of catastrophe strike their server. Because most of this stuff is born digital, and all they really have are those files.
One point I'd add to that too is that's a good question. Why aren't they doing it now? And that's a perfect example of how culture trumps technology. And as an old news guy, I can understand that, but I think that it's also an opportunity for us to use the culture here at the University of Missouri, at RJI, to reach out and to tell publishers, look, this is going to be part of your long-term survivability. You may not see something now, but there's going to be value in the future.
That one area of concern some publishers have is that once their content gets out there, it's often used by third parties to for their own profit. Very little of the value gets returned to the publishers. That's a huge problem in the newspaper industry. Here you have a model where there's value created by the content, after it leaves the publisher. Do you have any expectation, or should the publisher have an expectation that there's some of that profit is being returned to them? Or is the archive really the only value they're getting out of this? Some publishers already maintain archives, so that's not going to be a huge selling point for them.
That's true. So you have someone like the St. Louis Post-Dispatch, they're unlikely to ever convert. They don't want to submit digitally for that very reason. We're less concerned about archiving someone like the Post-Dispatch because they have significant archives of their own and they're well backed up. We're more concerned with the smaller, more local papers, and in that's why we're only really looking to get 90–95%. We recognize that there are some that will not convert, and we may have to negotiate a contract with some of the larger groups to deal with some kind of profit share method. That's one of those that we're less concerned with grabbing the type of newspaper that is already well archived because they're less likely to go dark. in the event they do go dark, we could look at purchasing those archives, something along those lines, but it's not really within our business model at this point.
Also worth mentioning too that media monitoring companies such as News Group are already working with newspapers with their content and returning value to them. So we're working along that same kind of value, that same kind of model. We're not changing the model, and we're actually going to hope to create a pie that grows and gets bigger with newspaper publishers too.
I think it's really smart to tie it to a business that can capitalize off of some of the benefits that this system could provide. But my question is, you talked a lot about RJI and News Group kind of sharing this database. And so I was wondering if you could elaborate on who would actually own the database and what would happen if, say, News Group decided that it wasn't beneficial to them anymore, or alternatively, if somebody else said, hey, this is really great, I want to get on this too, how would that be handled?
So that's an interesting licensing problem. We've spoken a little bit to the legal department on that, but so far as precisely how that contract would work, we have not negotiated at this point. It is likely that the university will require a license to use. Not necessarily, and if we choose to, if we end up having to sell our own, so News Group decides that they're done with the archive, once again, it all has to be negotiated in the contractual space later, and we haven't really met any agreements in that space yet, but it's likely the university will at least get a license to use that information for research purposes, and the license would be with the Press Association, so we would be getting that content strictly through them, not necessarily through the third parties. So, and should someone else come along and decide, hey, this is really great, well, once again, that'd be something we would negotiate with our business partner, and whether or not we wanted the third party to work with us. There are third parties in other states that do the same type of work, so we might be able to negotiate some kind of contract with them to get to those states, to get to that content, but once again, that's a further down the line. Once we have a proven model, once we've already worked with the states that we're interested in working in right now, which are the 14 that News Group currently works with.
I just have one more question. It seems like there's some work that needs to go into setting up this infrastructure and getting the newspapers on board and that kind of thing. And I was just wondering who would be staffing that and managing that and running all of that work that needs to happen.
So a lot of the infrastructure is already in place, which is one of the huge advantages of the partnership that we're discussing. News Group already has great relationships with the Press Association, and the Press Association has pretty good relationships with the newspapers. So that's kind of our chain of command so far as how do we really get this implemented. So far as starting off, we're trying to run it as lean as possible. So 1 or 2 technicians who can go around the state and get these newspapers up and running, and then it would likely just be managed by Ed McCain.
I'd like to mention that it's you just need a USB stick more or less, and there's a script on this USB that is not a labeling thing for
Yeah, that's, like I said, the cost estimate of $150,000 is arguably fairly realistic, and there's some extra padding built into there if we have to hire on a third person.
I'll piggyback on a couple of the questions just to make sure that I understand it correctly. It sounds like you're aiming for small and middle-sized news organizations,
Yeah,
right?
the ones whose data is at high risk for loss.
And when you say high risk for loss, are you thinking, because you've talked tornadoes and that, are you thinking that, or is the goal really that, hey, we need to preserve digital content for the future generations?
It's really more of a matter that there's limited space on a hard drive, and so content isn't kept indefinitely. It's usually left on a cycle, especially in a smaller case where they don't have the money or capacity to build and maintain significant servers. So it's really more being lost because after 3 years they delete it.
Right. Okay.
Or, you know, the paper closes down and then that's never archived.
Have you guys thought at all about you've talked a little about this, how do the news organizations make money? They can make money because theoretically the content's there forever, so they could do things with it. But have you talked in any more detail about how those news organizations would make money? Because as somebody who used to work at a newspaper, anything that will make money for them, they will be much more receptive to figuring out how to work with you all on the IT infrastructure to get it to the right people.
You want to fill that?
Well, one of the things that, I may turn this back to you, but one of the things that we looked at through our research is that there is value for the newspapers. We looked at various market segments that even News Group isn't dealing with, and they see value in the content as well. One of the things that we have to, one of the challenges that we acknowledge that we're going to have to deal with is the idea that this isn't going to be something that you're going to see $1 next month. It's going to take a while to build the archive. But there won't be a lot of cost. There won't be any cost put on the publishers, so it's actually a wise investment for the future. Chris, did you have any thoughts?
Yeah, it really is a relatively simple submission process, so the time costs are, almost strictly negligible. That's why we looked at budgeting a couple of days for training, and it's not, 3 full-day classes. There's a guy there looking at their infrastructure very passively and then takes, an hour to show them how to do submissions. And so it's a drag and drop sort of easy method, and if we can even tie into their content management system in the future, it would just be hey, this just gets mirrored whenever you put out the final version. So overall, their value is really more in a cost saving for the archive that will be maintained elsewhere should they lose their data. You can look at it almost like an insurance policy. There is a nominal dollar value associated with it, regardless of whether or not there's an actual loss.
I guess I'd just add one last point is, if any publishers were asking us, well, what's in it for me if I'm not going to see $1 tomorrow? We point to companies like News Group. Hey, they're already helping you guys already. So why not either join in or at least work with us to try and grow the size of the pie in the future?
Okay. And if you can talk, you talked about grants. Where do you think grants are going to come from?
So we've looked at groups like the Knight Foundation. And Dimitri, of course, has looked significantly. Oh, we do have a. So that's just a few of the organizations that would supply grants for a project such as this that we've looked at. Generally speaking, their previous applications were in line with our vision. No one doing actually the exact same thing, but the general concepts fall into the space that we would be operating in. So these would be something that would be generally a one-time grant, but it should be sufficient to cover our initial costs. And Dimitri would like to speak a little bit more to that. He did the basic research on it.
Covered it?
More or less, yeah. The most important donation on government was the 90s, and the Knight Foundation, and also there are some grants, and also federal government grants and programs. So on the current basis.
And one final question on a slightly different topic, but as you save this information, and you've talked about PDFs and print, and you want to get papers away from that, which is smart, and I don't know enough in terms of the smaller papers in the state, how much digital-only content they're doing that does not go in their paper. So I'm assuming that this is to save all content, not just stuff that appeared in the paper, but stuff that also appeared online. And then as the follow-up to that question, it's if a smaller paper is covering the Cardinals and they do 19 versions of a Cardinals game story because it's 13 innings, I assume you have some mechanism to save 1 or 2 of those 13 stories, but perhaps
that would
not
be part
all
of
13.
what a technician would do whenever they go to the paper is figure out at what point do we want to pull their content. So, if they publish it to the web 100 times, do we really want to take all of those? It's more of a question for future development of the algorithm that would have to be addressed to a technical computer scientist who would actually be building the algorithm. Naturally, the algorithm that's already in place is reasonably robust. But that's one of the advantages of being in a university is we have extraordinary access to computational knowledge, people doing research in this space. There's at least one professor who's actually researching the idea of whenever you look at a piece of content, when do you pull it, and what metadata do you pull with it? Do you pull the top 5 comments? Do you pull the author's name? How much of that is important? So there's some really interesting research going on in that space, and being a research-oriented institution, that gives us kind of a first-mover advantage in that as well. Does that answer your question? Excellent. Yes, sir.
So I think it was from 2008 till 2011, Google had a newspaper archiving program, and then it gave it up in 2011. It was criticized for being slow and expensive. Give any consideration to the future of Google possibly stepping back in, you know, and/or aligning themselves with an effort like yours? So, because their goal, of course, is to index and archive the world.
Should they choose to do so, what we will have is an archive already built with a reasonable amount of value behind it, and Google's been shown to be very acquisition friendly. So why would they go out and attempt to rebuild all of the content that already exists in our archive whenever they could simply acquire? And quite frankly, being acquired by Google wouldn't necessarily be a bad thing in our case, especially if it's, you know, reasonably well run and continues to align with the mission goals. And really, you can't do much to compete against them. So acquisition is, generally speaking, what would happen in that particular case. Being a public institution, it might be a partnership. It would really have to be negotiated at that time should they choose to do so. There's a lot more higher margin things Google is currently interested in. And I mean, like I said, should they choose to do it, we'd likely be a partner at the very least.
Any other questions from out in the group?
Yes, sir.
So, what sort of user fee do you plan to charge if I want to look up someone's archive? How much would I need to pay for it?
So that is more of a phase 2 space. The user fee would likely shift based on who we're selling to, which is generally speaking the way that archives tend to sell. So if they're selling to a law firm, they sell, you know, per user licenses at a higher price. If they sell to a university, it's a per user license at a better price. Given that we're an academic-based organization, we would likely go to just simply cover our costs. But considering that before there's any real value in that lookup, our research shows that the archive itself needs to be between 5 and 10 years old before people really start getting interested in that data, because that's whenever it becomes more difficult to find elsewhere. So we really haven't built that cost structure yet, simply because trying to predict those costs and expenses at 5, 10 years out is difficult at best and random guessing at worst. So with our estimates, and based on the discussions that we had with these various groups, such as the genealogists, such as the law firms, we estimate somewhere between $100,000 and $200,000 of revenue once we have a solid archive built of several states worth of information. But that's really there's a critical mass at whenever that really becomes valuable, and that estimate is really only right on order of magnitude.
Any other final questions? One final question? Okay, well, thank you very much, guys.
Thank you.